It gives me great pleasure now to introduce on stage from RTE, Mr. Dave Banning and Donal Gallaghel.
Very, yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome. Let's just jump straight in. Donal, everybody here knows an awful lot about Rory Gallaghel. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to find out anything that I don't know already, but can I start at the beginning and then jump all over the place? The beginning being, supposedly, he gets a ukulele at the age of 7. You're a lot younger, you wouldn't remember too much of that. Then he gets a guitar. Then he goes off and starts touring, literally at 15. Was he actually touring in Europe? And you were looking there at the age of 11 or 12 going, what's going on? Sorry.
Yeah. No, Rory actually auditioned for a show. He was trying to form a group in Cork City. And he had got his first guitar, he had gone through the acoustic onto a Solomon Solid 7 and black guitar, and he couldn't get a group together. He didn't want to necessarily go into a show band, but the only way for him to crank an amp up was being on stage. And he auditioned for a show band called Fontana, but he did tell them that he was 17 going on 18. Didn't tell him that he was still just doing his intercert or leaving cert.
Yeah, but he also told them something that they didn't want to hear, which is that everybody knows about show bands. Doesn't matter how you dressed. If you dressed that way, all the members of the band dressed the same way. Rory didn't. He didn't give in to that. How did he get away with that?
He just refused. Rory was stubborn, and he was compromising himself to obviously get more education and get out to the dance halls and perform for people. But so in effect what he did is he got into the show band, and it wasn't long before he transformed them, and they changed the name to Impact. And then instead of wearing the show band suits, which Rory didn't really wear, he'd never wear the tie, for instance, and he got them to wear like beat gear, as it was probably known, black polo necks and sort of a Beatlesque kind of look. And he changed it into being like an R&B band, like he'd say, you know, Georgie Fame, and he'd use the sax guys to do the Chuck Berry and all the Chuck Berry. In fact, I learned later on from Roddy Doyle that his book, The Commitments, that Rory was the template. He was the character. Yeah, so much so that they couldn't find Joey the Lips, the casting people. And one day I got a call from Alan Parker's office to know would Rory audition for the part, because they'd gone back to Roddy Doyle and said, we can't find the trumpet player. And so Rory said, no, it wouldn't be me. And I said, but they're now telling me that actually Roddy Doyle originally wrote the book. It was about a guitar player. And actually I still have one of the first copies, because he was launching the book at the Project Theatre in Dublin. And
I launched it.
You beat that soldier. And he wanted Rory to be at the launch.
Yeah.
And that's kind of was where, so eventually, Rory didn't, he reread the book, and I said, it's in your bookshelf. And he said, I really couldn't do it. And I said, well, at least have a cup of coffee with Alan Parker, because, you know, you'd never know. It's a music film, it'd be great. So he went on. And so I had to wait outside in it was Hubbard Casting in the West End.
Yeah.
And Rory came out, and I said, oh. And I was praying that he would take a part, because I thought it would actually give him a different way to go in his life. And
now, you see, there you go. Like, you're saying this all the time. You were trying to do something like that with Rory. And let's be perfectly honest, he was stubborn as whatever. He never really did a lot of the things that you wanted him to do. Let's jump forward, for instance, to, you know, somebody like Roger Glover from Deep Purple produces an album or something, and Ashton Blue, the record company, were going to say, we're going to really push this, we'll take this bit off, that bit off, and bang, this is going to be a massive big hit. The minute he heard the two words, big hit, He said, "You're not doing that." It's because he didn't want to have a big hit.
Yeah, he just didn't get it. I remember they finished the album, and Rory, again, was never satisfied when Roger Glover said, "That's the mix, and I'm not, and maybe," so then Rory thought, well, maybe in the cutting studio could change it.
Yeah.
And they cut the record, and then the next thing is I got a phone call to say, you're going on a plane to Los Angeles to Kendon Recorders to cut the album in that studio. And so I ended up staying at Chris Wright's house. He was one of the owners of the record company. And so I was able to play him. He was the one who said, Edged in Blue would be a #1 hit.
Yeah.
Take the guitar solo off the start, cut it down, edit a bit, and make 3 minutes. So I came back. I literally flew out on a Saturday and came back on the Monday with this new cut version. And Rory went ballistic. And it was just not on. And how dare they even think of that? I mean, it happened with going to my hometown.
I was just going to say, you
Polydor.
tried this kind of stuff a lot.
Polydor Records did an edit, and the guy came down to the gig in Washington. And when Rory heard that they'd edited his music, he refused to allow the guy backstage. It was embarrassing.
Was there no way around that kind of thing? I mean, if you think about it, like Bob Dylan was the main folk person of the 60s, and he dared do something different, and he got killed for it. If there had been Twitter around in '66, he'd be dead. And the point is that, he went electric. You're not allowed to do that, but he did it and proved it. Led Zeppelin put out an album without their name on the cover and without the name of the album on the cover, and they sold 40 million albums of it. Okay, that's one decision that worked. Led Zeppelin, in fact, and Rory, to me, are the two people that in that time never released a single. They just weren't into singles. Now, it worked for Led Zeppelin. A lot of people say it worked for Rory, and that's why they like him. But something else would have worked for Rory, too. And this is going to be a very long question, sorry, because it's this. People are going on about the blues all the time about Rory, and it's fantastic. I love it. But Rory wrote great rock songs. He wrote great commercial songs. We've just seen some versions of them there, of just how when you strip them back down to the skeleton versions. And would he not have even just let somebody else kind of, I don't know, I've done my work, there it is, it's there, do what you like with it. He wouldn't let anybody do anything. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he was a victim of himself in the sense that he wore so many hats. He was, by and large, his own producer, songwriter. He learned studio engineering. He would. The problem too is that he'd stay up all night, and then he'd come back early in the morning, and he'd get a couple of hours sleep, and he'd call you up and said, "I've just done a new mix." And then he was listening to the music, but he was still half asleep, and it was, it's too fast.
Yeah.
And I'll go back in tonight, and you're kind of going, Rory, take a break, calm down. There's no rush. But he was a dynamo.
But when we just mentioned the Edged in Blue thing, one of the points about that is he didn't want it to have no passion, as he would call it. And yet, when he brought out an album, he had overdubs and all that stuff on it. He did cheat or whatever. You know what I mean? He did do stuff that he thought that Roger Glover shouldn't have done. But with all that kind of idea, there's very different, Led Zeppelin, just to get back to it, they did a reggae song. How dare they? And it worked. You know what I mean? The Rolling Stones in '78 did disco, for God's sake. And it worked. Their biggest selling album is Some Girls. And all that stuff. So would he not just have... U2 went and did Octung Baby, and they took all the dance stuff and did something they weren't... But the essence of U2 was still there. The essence of the Stones was still there. Were you not able to tell Rory, don't worry, it's going to be fine. You can do the blues and do what you like and all the rest of it. But let's just do something with these great songs of yours instead of you being so stubborn leaving them in a box.
Well, I'd say to him, Rory, when we were kids, I said you were listening to Eddie Cochran, Ricky Nelson, Hello, Mary Lou, James Burton with the brilliant guitar solo on it. And I was going, if you think about what you listen to and what turns you on to, this is how it works. But at the same time, then he'd counter the argument and say, well, look what My Old Man's Dustman, well, it was a big hit for Lonnie Donegan.
Yeah, My Ding-a-Ling for Chuck Berry.
Yeah, but again, there's always a counter-argument. I became great friends with Lonnie Donegan. I was up and doing in the BBC with an interview because I did Lonnie's last album. And the guy said to him, why did you do my album? And he said, go and ask Bob Dylan why he did Froggy Went a Courtin'.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's always an argument.
Yeah,
Musicians.
a full Christmas album. Actually, funny thing is, one of the times you annoyed Rory most of all was a Lonnie Donegan one, when you gave him a Christmas present, and you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
Tell me about the story.
Oh, I was coming up, playing the Royal Albert Hall, and it was the 22nd or 23rd of December. And we'd been out on tour, and I always try to get Rory a present of some kind or something, you know, because he was a different kind of guy to get a present for. So, and the drummer got a new drum kit, and the agent who came down with the drum kit, Promuco, had set it up, and I was chatting to the guy and getting him a drink, and I said, "Oh, do you play yourself?" And he said, "Yeah, I play with Lonnie Donegan." And I said, "Lonnie Donegan?" I said, "Where is he? We haven't heard for years from Lonnie Donegan." And he said, "Actually, he's out in Brentford. He's here at present." And I said, "Oh, God, do you think he'd come to the gig tonight?" And the guy put a 6p coin, this is how long ago it was, put the sixpence in the payphone backstage, dialed the number and said, "You talk to him." And I was talking to Lonnie Donegan. I said, "Oh, we're at the Albert Hall tonight. Sorry, Lonnie." And I know short nose. Rory is such a big fan. He said, "Oh, I know who Rory is, and it's great. He keeps plugging me." And so he said, "Okay, I'll come." So Lonnie turned up, and he said, "As long as you've somebody waiting back, like to bring me back, I don't want to." I said, "Okay, gate 7 or whatever the backstage door was." And Lonnie turned up in a tuxedo because it was the Royal Albert Hall. Because actually, this was the first rock concert.
Yeah, they'd banned them for a bunch of
They'd
years.
banned rock, and they allowed, Rory was the first artist they allowed back in.
Yeah.
And so actually that night, Lonnie got introduced to Chrysalis Records, and that's where the Comeback
really?
album came from. So I said to Lonnie, "Look, this is a surprise for Rory, and if you don't mind, I'm putting you in a different dressing room." So, and he said, "Well, I'm not going on stage unless I get an announcement. I can't walk out and introduce Rory. You have to go out." So I had to go out and introduce Lonnie Donegan. Sorry. And I gave a build-up. And then Lonnie came on and said some wonderful words on Rory. And then I was trying to find Rory, and Rory was over on the side, almost getting sick. And I said, "What's wrong, Rory?" He said, "Never, ever." I said, "That's your Christmas present." He said, "Never, ever get me a present like that again." He said, "He's my hero. What are you doing to me?" He was so nervous. It took him 5-10 minutes before he could compose himself. Normally, Rory was on stage like a shot.
Do you know, the stuff you mentioned, just to stay with Lonnie Donegan for a second, it's not My Old Man's a Dustman. It's the skiffle kind of sound, is it? I mean, like, you know, like when you think of what Rory mastered, the electric guitar, the acoustic guitar, the slide, the regular stuff, the harmonica, the banjo, the dulcimer, the mandolin, was he always banging away on some instrument, always getting more proficient?
Well, I remember reading a lovely quote from a writer in Cork for the Evening Echo, and he said, "The one thing about Rory Gallagher, he'd get music out of a string vest."
Yeah. Yeah, he would actually. That's quite true. Listen, I'll tell you what I want to do. Like, I'm going to go back to some. I just want to look at some either anecdotes or apocryphal stories, famous ones. And I know you've probably talked about these 1,000 times, but I know that much, and I'd like to know more. Let's just start with one. Yeah, okay. Let's start with having trouble doing an album. In fact, he saw like a pretty famous gig to see. He was there at a gig in the Winterland in San Francisco, and the Sex Pistols were playing. They were doing their tour, and it was a disaster from the word go. Every gig was a disaster, and they were falling apart, and they were absolutely useless, and it was terrible. All they left us then was one great album, and that's about it. But they're doing something on stage, no matter how shambolic, that Rory is working with Neil Young's producer, Elliot Mazer, getting on fine, maybe, but there was a niggle in his brain. He didn't know what was necessarily going on. And then he saw the Sex Pistols, and he said, "Feck it, that's what I'm missing." And he literally went off, told Mazer to get lost in the nicest possible way. He did write liner notes later on to say how great Rory was, so it's cool. But anyway, point is that they got on okay. He decided that he needed to get some raw whatever back of the thing. He sacks a member of the band, he leaves one behind, goes off to Germany, makes a whole new album. Is that 100% true, that he just couldn't stick to somebody else's idea to make him something that he didn't want to be, and he went back to the rawness of it? Was Photo Finish the next album or something?
Yeah,
Rory wrote.
it probably was an eye opener.
Yeah.
Because I remember Rory ringing me and saying that he'd gone to see this, and he said, "I don't know whether I saw one of the best gigs of my life or one of the worst."
Yeah.
He said, he said the audience were booing them off.
Yeah.
He said, but actually, it's the rawness, it's the garage.
Yeah.
It's, and it had I think the San Francisco album, but it was meant to be Rory's American album, and Elliot Mazer was a fantastic engineer, producer that actually Rory should have worked with very early on in his career, because Elliot had turned up on the Last Taste tour, and he had produced a guy called Jake Holmes, and Jake was a singer-songwriter who wrote for Frank Sinatra, and he was on Polydor, so he was one of the opening acts on the Last Taste tour. And this guy Elliot saw Rory and went, "I've got to get you over to the States, to Nashville," because Elliot had put area code 615 together.
Oh, yeah.
And so he knew all the musicians in Nashville. And actually, Rory was contractually tied down because of Taste and couldn't take Elliot up on the offer. And then Elliot went off and did the Harvest album with Neil Young. He co-produced, so that kind of a sound or a softness, and actually
Yeah, I didn't
listening to
realise he did
Chantel
there
earlier,
so long.
and you can hear the early strains of the earlier songs.
Right.
It would have been a very interesting combination. It should have worked in San Francisco, but it just, I think Rory, it just became top heavy for Rory, and he just wanted to get back to the cutting three-piece.
Yeah. Okay, like the two biggest stories or the whatever of is I'm going to give the Jimi Hendrix just for a moment, right? You know what I'm going to say here. I mean, is there a connection between South Africa and the Isle of Wight and Jimi Hendrix saying that Rory is the greatest guitarist in the world?
Well, the Jimi Hendrix quote, no one can verify that or whatever, but for me, the first time I read that statement was a South African disc jockey who had a web and apparently was friends with Hendrix.
Yeah.
So and people keep asking me, is it true? Is it true? And I kind of go, well, I remember meeting Hendrix when he came to see Taste, either by chance or whatever. That was with Eric and Norman in the early days. And oddly enough, we'd just done a bill. He'd played the Saturday and Taste were on the Sunday at Woburn Abbey.
Yeah.
And Rory had become friends with Tim Rose. And Tim Rose had a hit with Morning Dew, quite a big hit. And so his follow-up song was Hey Joe. So anyway, Tim had turned up as well. And Rory had Tim on jamming. And Hendrix came into the back of the room. And Tim tore off the guitar and said, "Sorry, I've a bone to pick with this guy. He's stolen my song." Because his version was at 43 and Hendrix has just overtaken it. And Rory nudged me and said, "Go down and make sure he doesn't put a finger on Jimmy." He said, "That's the last thing I'd want to have happen." So I had to go down and sort of slow Tim down before but Hendrix had spotted that there was some danger in the room and that this guy was coming toward him. And Hendrix, of course, your man forgot he was like a paratrooper. He'd been in the military. Yeah. And he went, "Tim Rose, man," and just smothered him completely.
Yeah.
And he couldn't move. And Tim was cursing me because he had a few whiskeys. And I said, "Tim, I'm just trying to get a few cokes for the band." And Hendrix turned around and said, "Hey, man, come on, Tim, I want to buy you a drink." And Tim just turned to me and said, "Oh, God, I'm a sucker for the drink. Okay, whiskey. Anybody buys me whiskey is okay." And he said, "And I want 3 cokes for the band as well."
Right, brilliant.
So, I'm not sure, but I think where the quote sort of then came was that Taste had opened on the Isle of Wight Festival on the Friday night,
Yeah.
had been a huge success. There was the early story of the festival. Hendrix was on late on the Saturday. It was a bit of a, it was 2 in the morning, and it all kind of was
Yeah,
going
the
wrong.
weather was
He was
bad, everything
unwell.
was wrong, yeah. But I mean, Taste got 5 encores
Yeah.
that night. So the point about that is, like, maybe Jimmy was a little bit kind of miffed, like, you know, like, what's it like being the greatest guitarist in the world? I don't know, ask bloody Rory
It
Gallagher.
could have been said in a sarcastic way. It could have
Yeah.
been, you know.
That's cool, though.
Well, you can see some cocky journalists going, so what is a good, you know, like,
Yeah.
bad gig, was it the best guitarist in the world? Why don't you go and ask Rory Gallagher? And it's like, you know.
Okay, well, listen,
Yeah.
since we're on apocryphal
Let's guess
or
one.
truth, the big one is the Stones in some ways, because I knew about this when I mean, in fact, that what do you call it, Isle of Wight. When I remember listening to Kid Jensen at night on the radio, and like he'd come back from the Isle of Wight, and to hear something like that, it's just weird. Like, you know, you just didn't get that kind of thing. To hear somebody raving about an Irish band, I mean, honestly, the pride, it just was fantastic. And he played a track and everything. He said Rory Gallagher's name and all this kind of thing, and said the rest of the band. It was just brilliant. Like, it was just a really big thing, that Isle of Wight thing. I presume it was pretty big in your world too, wasn't it?
Well, no, it wasn't, because the sad thing was that the band were on shaky ground. Rory wanted to change the manager and get rid of the manager, and he wanted John and Richard, he wanted to keep the band, but they'd been sort of seduced by the manager, who was going to get them Rolls Royces and mortgages, and Rory's going to go, this guy isn't paying anyway. Tastes were now quite huge in Europe, and the band, I was the road manager, we were still playing through the PA system Rory had inherited from the show band. And I'm playing big venues.
Well, were you road managing at that stage?
Yeah.
And you were manager as well?
No, I wasn't
Right.
manager. No, Rory had it was a management, and from Belfast. And the guy was Eddie he was quite a clever guy, but
You you managed Atomic Rooster at that time, did you?
no. After I lost my job with Taste, because the band split up.
Oh, right. Okay.
Rory had there was no money, because he had a small bit in reserve, but he wasn't getting any royalties. He wasn't getting anything, and so I had to go
And
and
his
find work.
flatmates ripped all his money off, didn't they?
Yeah. So somebody said to me, "There's a job going with Atomic Rooster. Would you go out with Atomic Rooster?" And I was going, I'll do anything, because Rory was waiting to get his situation resolved with the management and record company. So I went from going for this lovely 3-piece band, Vox AC30, a bass stack, a drum kit, and to a band that had a Hammond organ, 2 Leslies. The guy the guitar player, Can was his name, had 4 stacks, and Rick Parnell was the drummer. He had a double drum kit.
And in particular, Vince Crane.
Yeah, and they had one big truck that you had to drive, and the band had a section in that, and they were smoking all the time. So the fact of if you were stopped, you were bussed. Yeah, I mean, it was just, and
It was a good learning curve for you in the same way as the show bands was for Rory.
oh yeah, when you had to do, you know, the Locarno ballrooms 3 floors up, and carrying a Hammond up the stairs, and yeah, you come back all is forgiven.
Okay, well, you're talking about the limousines. You got to get the story right here, because I didn't know there was so much detail about the Rolling Stones. I mean, that Rolling Stones thing was big, and it was real, and it was huge, and there was no, like, it wasn't. I thought it was just he was there for half an hour, and he just played a few songs, was gone. We're talking a few days here. Well, a lot of the time we're trying to get Keith out of bed. And also, Keith was not getting on with Mick. They hated each other, and it was the bad time for his drugs and his life and all the rest. But you go over to, like, I mean, the phone call comes through, you're in Cork. Tell me about the phone call. Like, I mean, Rory's in bed.
Yeah, well, you're talking the end of 74 into 75. And
They were looking for a Mick Taylor replacement.
But it was also the background being in Ireland. The Troubles were on, and it was a period of time where there were a lot of kidnappings of people if they were prominent, and ransom money and stuff like that. So you know, not that you felt Rory was immune, but you always had to be careful. So the phone rang at 12:30 at night. So the only time a phone would ring at 12:30 if somebody had died. And you kind of answer the phone, and this guy said, can I speak to Rory? And I said, sorry, have you got the right number? And he said, this is the number I was given. And I said, I know who you mean, but he's not here right now. And I was making all this kind of defensive situation. Find out more who are you and what you want. And I said, I said, you'll have to call back in about 30 minutes. I can go and find him. And I said, who shall I say is calling? And he said, tell him it's Ian Stewart. And I immediately clicked with me, and they were looking for, and I was about to say, with Rolling Stone, And I said, and would that be connection with what? And he said, the Rolling Stones. And I said, okay. I said, I ran upstairs. Rory had gone to bed. It was like an early night for Rory, for some, one of the few early nights he took. And I was waking Rory up, and I said, Rory, the phone's going to ring. And I said, the Stones are on the phone. And he said, he thought I was winding up because on tour we'd always play pranks. And he said, I haven't time for any pranks, Donal. It's like, honestly, I said, the last phone call was Ian Stewart. And I said, he's ringing back. And sure enough, so that was very early January. It was just after Christmas. And so it was like the first dates were the 12th, 13th, and 14th. Would Rory be available to go to Rotterdam? And so Rory agreed to that. And then a few nights later, another call back. Could you make that the 15th, 16th? And then could you make it the 20th? And they kept saying, the Stones mobile, they need to repair it. And there was some repairs being done. It was probably a cover for Keith, So then we were going back to London. We were heading off to Japan on the 30th of January. So the window was closing down. So we got to London, and there was a ticket sent to the office. I still have the ticket. And just to confirm, it was an open return. There was no date set in it. So, and I said, they've only sent one ticket, Rory. And he said, yeah, I'm going by myself. And I said, he said, it's only a jam session. They don't want any. Yeah, I can't write. It's sticking out a mile, And I said, not only that.
So it's sticking out a mile. They're looking for a replacement for Mick Taylor,
exactly.
who was getting fed up with the Stones, and they had to put somebody in there who had taken over from Brian Jones. So they had to get a new person in there. Yeah. And they had Ry Cooder written down. I think they had Peter Tosh.
That was much later.
Peter Tosh then?
No. They said in an article.
Steve Marriott.
Steve Marriott. I mean, well, the way I see it is that all those guitar players came later. Is that Rory was specifically the one targeted.
Right, that's the point. So they only had Rory in mind.
And Rory went over, and then when he departed,
they had to go with those.
And I'd said to Rory, like you going over, don't be crazy. They're recording the session. You need somebody there to. And they said, no, it's a jam session. I can't. They're recording it. But anyway, so Rory. It's a longer story, all the session bits, but
he lands in Rotterdam,
and then and I said, "Well, ring me and let me know about the Japanese tour." And at that time, the Stones were banned from Japan. Rory was already a huge guitar star out there, so this was his second tour, and he was honourable, and Rory was perplexed because he said, "I can't let a Japanese fan down. I can't let fans down." And Mick was all for Rory, and with Keith, it was all over the shop. So Rory just, Mick said, "Would you go up? Keith wants to talk to you." And Rory went up to Keith's room. Keith's door was wide open. He was comatose in the bed. And Rory went back, stayed up all night, went back every half hour to see when Keith would wake up. And then Rory just decided, it's not for me, packed his bag. And I got a phone call to say, I'll be at Heathrow Airport. Rory wasn't going to make the flight. I had put the band on a flight to Japan, so I had to change flights, and I waited for Rory, and we flew on a later flight. And I was going, Rory, what's happened? And Rory said, I'm so tired, I'll fall asleep. And I was on the plane going, But basically, he just went, I don't know. He said, oh, if they really want me, they can come after me. But that's the days before text messages. And, you'd have to write a letter and wait 3 weeks.
And did he do a few sessions with the Stones?
No. Later on, Mick Jagger wanted Rory on his solo albums.
All right.
Go out to New York and do it.
And Jagger himself calls to the airport in Rotterdam to collect him, yeah. And he was looking for the cheapest taxi. Is that true?
Well, that's what it was a bitter winter's night, and the flight, and so Rory, I wanted to carry the guitar case and the amp. It was a little Fender Champ and the Strat he'd gone over with, and an overnight bag, just to get that in, and arrived off the plane, and he said, Mick himself was at the airport, which was very nice and great.
Yeah.
Went up and down the taxi line negotiating the best fare to Hilversum. So, no stretch limo.
Yeah, right, indeed. Okay, just a couple of other people, I suppose. Johnny Marr from the Smiths. Did Johnny Marr actually get in touch and say, like as though, he was cold turkey, he needed to touch that guitar? Is that really true that he goes down, it's just 5 minutes and he stays 10 hours?
Yeah, I bless him. He's a lovely man. Actually, Rory, this was after Rory had died, so, it was a bit solitary and lonely, but I was working on loads of stuff. And I was driving back to Ireland, and I was actually going through the toll booth in Wales, and the mobile rang, and it was Johnny Marr. And he got in, I'm going through the toll booth right now. Anyway, he said, oh, is there any chance to actually hold Rory's guitar and the Strat and see it sometime? And I said, oh, of course, yeah, every chance, Johnny. When are you thinking? So, could it come tomorrow? And I went, oh, I hadn't heard. And I said, oh, you want to come tomorrow then? Okay. I said, I headed back up to London. I was so pleased that,
But he also did a thing, didn't he have all pictures of Rory's guitar out somewhere, even before the Smiths maybe? He was so obsessed with all this that he blowtorched his own guitar and the whole thing went on fire and he ruined it. All these stories, they're true, aren't they?
Well, that's the one he tells in Ghost Blues, that documentary. Yeah, he tells that in Ghost Blues about being at school and...
What about Brian May as well? Because I know that were Queen kind of starting off when Taste were doing good, and then Brian May came along with Freddie once and had introduced this as our new singer and all this kind of stuff. Yeah,
well, it was just the period of time with Taste and Rory on us. We lived in a bedsit in Earl's Court, Phil Beach Gardens to be precise. It was like a crescent. So, and lots of bands, because there was lots of bedsits. So you'd see a single wheelbase transit or a double wheelbase transit. So the guys who had the double wheelbase had a few bob probably. Yeah. So you'd say hello to they were musicians. So, and then one day I was just sitting into the van, Taste van. This guy knocked on the door, and he said, "Oh, are you with the band Taste?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm the road manager." And he said, "Oh, playing the marquee. Is there any chance if we come down?" And it was himself and Roger Taylor. And he said, "Is there any chance if we come down, we could get to meet Rory backstage?" And I said, "Oh, sure." Because the marquee had a policy that just cleared the venue out. And so anyway, sure enough, they turned up. And he was such a gentleman. I'd said to Rory that these guys were... And Rory said, "Sure, yeah." So I brought them backstage and left them chat, and that's the story about the AC. It's in that documentary that's on Monday about how he got his sound. So then, a few days afterwards, I met Brian again in the street, but his band was called Smile.
Yeah.
So they had a double wheelbase transit, so they were kind of grand, and Smile was it. And he said, do you ever have any support slots on Rory's gigs? And I said, well, call the agent and tell him, it's a guy called David Oddy. If you ring David and say you met me and see what's out there. So this is a little while afterwards. But anyway, the gig was Dunstable Tech. And so the next few weeks later, I bumped into Brian again on the street. And he said, "Oh, we've got a gig. Thank you very much for, the introduction." And he said, "We're on with you in Dunstable." He said, "Does Rory do sound checks?" And I kind of went, "Sound checks?" So they were already thinking big.
Yeah.
I mean, sound check? What's this? We're still with the show band PA here, And so I said to Rory, he's asked me an odd question. And Rory said, "Oh, I know." He said, "We do so." He said, "Actually, I'll go up." He said, "And I'll change my string. Just tell them I want to restring the guitars, and I'll come up and see them." And Brian was beside himself, and I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Great." He said, "Because we've got a new singer, and I really want to see get Rory's opinion of our new singer." So sure enough, Rory turned up early on the Saturday gig in Dunstable, and they went on stage, and they just changed I still have the ad. And
Smile are now
there's
green.
a smile, yeah.
Yeah.
And so Brian came and came straight over, and he said, "I'd love to know what Rory thinks." And he said, "But he's got to go on stage." And I said, "Well, just pop in, Brian. I'm sure he did." And Brian said, "Rory, what do you think? What do you think of the singer?" And Rory said, "Band is great." He said, "I think you found a new Little Richard."
Little Richard.
That was
Really?
Rory's
Okay.
statement.
Yeah,
It was very accurate.
Right, yeah. And what about, just while we're on names, Eric Clapton, there was a thing that Eric Clapton became very famous and very huge, and Cream were the before Taste and all that kind of thing, or around the same time. And he was a bit lost in some ways. And he says that meeting Rory Gallagher and listening to Rory Gallagher brought me back to where I had to be, which is the blues. It was Rory that brought him back to the blues. And then you go on Taste, or you go on tour, Taste does, with the Only Blind Faith tour of America and all the rest, etc. Was that did you understand, did you get the impression from Eric that he really appreciated what Rory Gallagher stood for and what he was?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he did. I mean, we did, actually, and I don't want to be long-winded about it, the reason I was to go back to college. Rory had decided to relocate in Belfast as a springboard for London, and because the management was up there and there were more visiting bands of that ilk coming to the north that weren't coming south. So I got a postcard from Rory saying, "Oh, we've got a gig with Cream. They're coming over to play the Ulster Hall. We need an extra pair of hands." So I took my thumb out, decided not to go back to college, and went up to Belfast to find out Cream had cancelled the gig. But they did come over and did 3 nights, but in old show band halls, so it was extraordinary. I got put to show their crew out to places I didn't even know. Yeah. Out in it's a seaport and then there was one in Ballymena. And they were the wrong kind of venues for Cream, but it was a double bill they were there for about a week, so the friendship, and then when they were doing their farewell concert, so the invitation went out to do that show, so that was great. And in fact, that night, because there were very few guys in a road crew, you didn't have teams of guys, so you'd help the other band. And I remember Mick Turner, Ginger's was drum tech at the time, saying, "Could you take the guitars backstage?" And and there was Eric, Jack, and Ginger hugging each other for the last time. And I got out a pen and paper, and I got the last set of autographs of the 3 Cream guys. So yeah, and then '69, or a tour of Blind Faith in America. So that was half it was given to Free, and the other half was given to Taste. So. And on tour, but by then Taste was already in jeopardy. Rory was not with the manager, and I remember Eric asking me one night, and he said, "I'd love to chat to Rory, but he seems very distant, and he wants to do him." But and then in Rory's latter years, when Eric found Rory had problems, he wanted to sponsor Rory, and Rory and he went out to dinner a few times, and I wasn't at those dinners, so I can't say, but it was, we had a tour manager, Philip Morell, who drive Rory, and he was a connection in between Eric. And Eric was trying to help, in fairness. But I think Rory would be lecturing him, you got to go back into the blues.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, like, I met you in Finsbury Park at one of the Vince Parr's, whatever you call it, the flat. Yeah, and I didn't know anything about the fact, like I'd seen Rory play his last Dublin gig, the one at Trinity College outside the bank. I'd seen him in, you know, the Olympia, and he was looking pretty bloated. I did a thing for Channel 4. He was, you know, it was, something was wrong. But I mean, like, if I'd seen him then and he was fine the next day, I wouldn't have even thought about those years. But I met you and you said to me that it's bad, Rory's not doing well. I was absolutely shocked. I didn't know anything about this at all. And he died soon enough after that. When he went into hospital, did you feel as though Rory was actually going to be fine? He was one of the longest, he spent a long time in hospital, but he came out okay, didn't he? And then complications kicked in, unforeseen.
Yeah. Well, the bizarre thing was I was trying to get Rory to save himself from himself in some ways. Initially, in 91, at the end of 1990 into 91, I kind of engineered Rory into a clinic. And then, you know, it wasn't a voluntary situation and it wasn't sexual, but anyway, he'd got in there. And then I'd learned from the people in the clinic that actually, you know, because, everyone was assuming it was alcohol. And they said, this is prescription drugs. Where is he, who are these doctors? Where is he getting it? So then they brought in the doctor who was looking, who was also my doctor, and the next thing, there was one hell of a row. And it was the early stages of it, people assumed prescription, if you get it from a doctor, was all good. He makes alcohol and it's the devil's brew, you know. He was innocently taking a lot of the medication, which was having, you know, was things to help him sleep or fly, and then it was just growing, and it actually, he was such a private and quiet person, you just never noticed it. And as you say, he was, later on, you know, we switched doctors and then switched to a doctor, and the next guy was just as bad, if not worse. But then you didn't know how many doctors Rory was visiting either. So he always seemed to have a prescription for something. So, yeah, and eventually then he was so ill and you were cancelling tour. On one hand, you know, if Rory was you know, I was afraid to go in the door or try and get into his place because you felt he'll damage himself. And actually, to keep him safe, was on tour, you'd have to take a few faulty gigs. So I'd book a few warm-up gigs in case, you know, it wouldn't work. But he always rose to the occasion. And then once he got going, he was great. And then I found on tour, he had actually healed himself on tour. And it was the loneliness on his own when you took time off. So it was between the devil or the deep blue sea, you know. You really couldn't. And I look back and I feel guilty about it. We shouldn't have done those dates. We should have pulled that. But you know, you were in a no-win situation, and I really didn't understand, you know, the body as much as I do now. And then again, he wouldn't go into a hospital, and I'd booked a bed for him in the Cromwell, and his doctor, I said, and I'd promised Roy I'd never section him or do anything like that, and I just said, you know, to the doctor's going, whatever it takes to put him in there. He has to go in. He had sort of locked himself away, and they wouldn't sign off on him. And I said, you know, he'll be dead in 24 hours. So I rang this other very good specialist doctor, and he said, look, he said, if you were on the street and you saw somebody knocked down or fall or injured in the pavement, what do you do? And I said, you dial emergency services. He said, that's what you have to do. And then, you know, so I went up and confronted Rory and said, that's a simple choice. And he said, okay, give me 48 hours and I'll think about it. And I said, you don't have 48 hours. So got him in. He was a couple of weeks in the Cromwell Hospital. I was taking the family out. Hadn't much time spent with the family, but so. And then I got a call one day say, oh, would you come in and meet the transplant team? And I'm going, why do I have to meet a transplant team? And they said, oh, Rory requires a... And I thought the worst was going to be diabetes or something. You know, I really had no... So it was quite a shock. And then to discover that the doctor who hadn't really helped had turned up at the hospital, and he had told the team he doesn't want to. So I said to the people in the hospital, I said, the guy's a liar. And they said, who is he? And I said, well, he's supposed to be a doctor. And they said, oh, we thought he was one of the road crew.
Wow.
Because this man was just... So anyway, it was one of the things I promised Rory never to touch the guy. But
Okay,
anyway,
like, I mean...
yeah, so the transplant went well. He was doing well. It was great. And then the transplant team said, well, you can get an ambulance, take him back to the Cromwell again, and he'll be fine. He'll be closer to you, and that, you know. And I booked an ambulance to remove him the next day. That he was healing well and all was going. And they said, "Oh, we need to hang on to him another few days. He's picked up a bit of a bug in the hospital."
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry, that's a bit too.
No, I mean, like,
didn't mean to go off
all
that
his
slope.
life. I mean, like, nobody knew Rory better than you did, and yet you've said before you've never had a really kind of heart-to-heart as such. You know, like, it just wasn't done maybe in those days, that kind of thing. But I mean, you also feel you didn't really know him at all. So was Rory sad? Was he a sad bloke a lot of his life?
Yeah, he had a melancholy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And also, if you surround yourself with the blues, you know, it's like osmosis. You bring the whole thing into your life. I mean, you know, and if not only that, if you're lyric writing in a blues idiom, you know.
As John Lee Hooker said, you never get out of the blues alive. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're compounding, you know, but at the end of the day, that's what he was. He was a blues man, and he lived and died the blues.
Funny,
you know.
you mentioned, like, songs. I mean, would I be reading too much into his songs if I sort of quoted a line or something? Like, for instance, even like Philby, which I wouldn't mind talking about. Like, we said, "The stranger in my soul, I'm disconnected, but I don't need pity." Could I read something into a lot of his songs and say, geez, he was trying to tell us something? I mean, not like kind of David Bowie's last album or something, and then he dies 2 days later, but something like that. Like that, there's maybe a bit more in the song lyrics than I might have ever thought.
Yeah, but on reflection, he wore his heart on his sleeve. I mean, he did.
Did you ever see him write? Did he go off into a quiet place to write, or on tour? And did you see him writing songs and coming up with songs?
Yeah, because you could never, you know, you'd ask him about songs, and you'd kind of say, like "Edged in Blue," which to me is one of the saddest songs he could write. And I said, but Rory, it's a fast song, and it's the one I was trying to do as a single. He said, yeah, but he said that's a songwriter's, not a trick, but basically, he said it's such a sad song, and I sped it up.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it'll be too mournful. So, you know, and then what's fascinating then to hear the likes of Chantel, who did wonderful versions of Rory's music. And I was saying to her afterwards, like, you know, I'll admit you're gone. I mean, it's a heartbreaker song. But then you, like, I'm not surprised when she played that. And I was going, I took a whole new different meaning into the song. So but that's the art of songwriting, and then particularly an interpretation by somebody else. You hear something new or different in it, you know?
And, like, okay, just a few last bits I want to mention, which is like, that album, by the way, San Francisco thing, didn't you bring that out and do, like, the one that we supposedly never heard, even though some bits probably did come up in full to finish, did they?
Well, what occurred, that was sort of confined to the vaults, and when Daniel, my son, who's here tonight, got involved. Now, again, the gene that bypassed me from the dad and the music and whatever, it certainly ended up in Dan and his ability to play. And he hears a lot of difference and he's so well read on Rory's interviews, he's read every interview and the whole thing, and he said, would you mind if get people to go in the studio and look at this album? And he said, I think I know what Rory wouldn't have been happy about and I said, good luck to you.
Yeah.
I mean, just to have another generation revisit something, and I thought, well, it's as close as you can get in terms of somebody understanding the guitar work, keyboards, and it was a youth factor as well. And I thought, and what he turned the album around, and I actually, when he played it to me then, it was entirely different, and I thought, I could live with that.
Was Rory superstitious? I know he was religious, or he had his religion. But was he superstitious? Like he was able to fly all over the world, and then suddenly, did he get a fear of flying many years later?
Again, you get into the blues idiom. I mean, I think Rory was a very dignified, quiet guy. Don't necessarily was religious, but obviously because you're brought up and you're trained and you're fashioned into it, you become religion there's an elements of superstition. I mean, be it the visitations and the whole thing. It's and the rosary beads and the whole thing. It takes you a long time to separate fact from fiction. So, because he was living in a completely different world to but he was just a decent human being. He was, socialist, and he was just a very honourable person. So, but a lot of he used to you grew up with, Irish families, and there were card playing and fortune telling and reading tea leaves in a cup, and so that there's a lot of that in Rory's songs, all that very early. Going to the fairgrounds, tattooed ladies when we'd go to the fairground in Cork, and so the gypsy lady, the tattooed lady, but he was always seeing the parallels with blues music and kind of Irish traditions and superstitions, so that element always came out.
And just one or two last bits. When he brought keyboards in, and was that like something, I need my sound fleshed up, I want something different here, and he knew what he was doing all along. That was entirely him. Every decision with an album was his.
Well, initially, you're talking about Blueprint and Lou Martin period,
Daughter of the Everglade stuff.
Yeah. Rory thought it'd be nice to have a little bit of keyboards, but not full on. But actually, he was looking for a keyboard player who could also play a bit of rhythm guitar. And Lou had been in Killing Floor with Rod Diath, so we knew him well. And Rod said to Rory, well, Lou can play a bit of guitar. So the next thing I found out, Rory is on an Italian tour with a four-piece.
Yeah.
And he had a Horner pianette, and then basically Rory kind of thought, well, Lou's guitar playing, no, it doesn't work. But actually, I like the idea of the keyboards stretching it out. So it grew, and that's thus the title of the album, Blueprint. This was a new, a departure from the three-piece into the four-piece.
What do you think, finally, that he would think of this? Ballyshannon every year. Like, 30 years since his death now, next year or two, I'm sure there'll be some...
He'd be embarrassed.
Yeah.
I mean, he'd be so pleased to bits. I mean, he wouldn't believe it himself, because I remember Rory always wanted to come back to Ballyshannon and play a gig, it was the Ballyshannon Folk Festival, and Martin Carthy and people like that, and Rory. Yeah. So anyway, the closest gig we could get was Sligo. And so we went down and played a venue in Sligo, and then took the day off the next day and my mother came up from Cork, and we met my mother, and we came on into Ballyshannon, and to have a look around, and you know, I wasn't born in Ballyshannon, I was born in Derry, so I didn't know Ballyshannon and such. So, but anyway, it was about 6 p.m, and over in the port side, we went into one of the bars to have a drink in the evening, and sat down quietly in the corner. My mother, Rory, myself, and I went up and ordered some drinks. And I saw these guys looking strangely over it. And the next thing, one of the guys came down from the bar, and he walked over and he said, "Is it yourself, Mona Gallaghel?"
Yeah, perfect.
Is this the boy? And Rory got such a kick out of it. And I remember him saying to me, and he saw the poster on the wall for the folk festival. He said, "God," he said, "if they'd only asked me, I'd love to play that. I'd play that for free, you know."
Yeah.
And I was telling Barry O'Neill that later on. So, you know.
And when he was touring, just like in terms of other stuff besides music, I know there was nothing else besides music for Rory, because that's all he ever wanted, to be on stage playing. That's what it was all about. The bit of, like the Dashiell Hammett stuff and the kind of the hard-boiled detectives of American fiction and that, did he really got a kick off all that, did he? He liked reading those books?
Oh yeah, I mean he just absorbed all that. He kind of Patricia Highsmith and people like that, and I think I remember him going to Purple Noon with Alan Dillon, which was the original.
That was his favourite actor, wasn't it? Alan Dillon.
One of his favourite actors. Yeah, and that was the original Talented Mr. Ripley.
Yeah,
that was and it was subtitled, and of course, as a kid, I used to hate subtitle. Rory, why are we going to the subtitle movie? You know, and no, but he'd absorbed all that crime world, and I suppose it was also a source for his writing. But that was his level of entertainment. I remember one of the disappointing things is he went to Patricia Highsmith was doing a book signing, and he queued up, but she never turned up. So. I mean, he was that, and at one point, amongst the few business ideas, and he said, "Don't," because I was saying, "Oh, you could do this," and Rory was, just stick to the music, stick to it. And he said, "But okay, if you want to start a weekly magazine on crime," he said, "like, there is no magazine for crime writing." So he said, "Oh, I'd
look at it
be
now,
up
the
for
biggest thing in podcasts. Okay, listen, finally, I want to get back to just one last thing, which is where I started, which is you and what you tried to do with Rory all the time. And I think I'm looking for, were you frustrated? I mean, I'll give you an example again, like, for instance, somebody like, there was the new wave of British heavy metal, 78, 79 direction, around the same time that Taste were already established, and a lot of people wanted to throw Taste in with that, and it mightn't have been a bad thing. It was a train that was rolling, and who knows where it might have gone, even though Rory would have had no interest in it. But one of the biggest bands to come out of that was Def Leppard, and they decided, okay, we'll sell our soul, we'll let them do what they want, this record company. They bring in Mutt Lange, a big producer, they make it go to Beavis and Butthead and all in the middle of America, and we're going to sell some albums, and you can do what you like with our music, even though we're whatever. And they prettied it up, Eurovisioned it up in some ways, with all due respect. They brought out Hysteria, and it sells 10 million plus. Then they brought out Pyromania, and it sells 10 million plus. I think it's the only band around who brought out like 2 full albums of, new material that did that. Like, whatever, I'm not saying that it worked, okay? So from your point of view as manager, it's like, oh God, Rory, would you just look, it's fine. Leave all that stuff. You've done that. It's great. It's the blues. You've done your songs. Can I just take it over to this guy here? You must have been just very frustrating.
Also, you'd hear bands nick Rory's riffs, the heavy metal bands. I mean, because he never gets credited. And from even the early days of seeing the support act was Earth, which later became Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
And Tommy Iommi, I meeting him, the singer was a shy guy and he wouldn't talk to anybody. But it's so, the origins, there's a lot of Taste riffs in Black Sabbath. More recently, AC/DC are doing their final gig in Dublin. And Brian, I got a call from a friend, George Fearon, who's a lawyer for Brian, and he said, "Oh, I'm retired," he said, "but I'll make one last journey to Ireland. He said, will you come and meet me in Dublin? And I said, what are you coming over for? And he said, ACD's last gig. And I go, George.
Yeah.
And he said, well, Brian's 75 and he's retiring and I'm retiring. So it's kind of, and then there's an article in the Irish Times about AC/DC and saying how, for Brian at any rate, and the guys, that Rory was the hero,
course,
you know.
yeah.
But you wish a lot of the bands like that gave Rory fair credit back then. I remember even Alice Cooper, and you listen to the first album, and there's like straight Rory guitar riffs straight off it. I mean, Brian May, bless his heart, will tell you that Tie Your Mother Down is a Rory guitar riff. You know, I mean, even though it doesn't sound like it, but that's...
Yeah, but he does get like the kudos big time. I mean, look at all this. Look at these weekends here. Look at the same weekends in Athens and all the rest. And one of the things about all that is the fact that the new media, YouTube is good for Rory, isn't it?
Yeah.
People can go back and say, like, see, he didn't have the hits of the singles, so therefore hit radio or old radio isn't playing Rory Gallagher. A lot of stuff, he doesn't fit in even though he should. But we're going, let's check this guy out. And people are finding him out for themselves almost. And realise this guy was bloody great, you know, even though there's no hit singles. Kind of
yeah, yeah. And they're able to compare and say, well, why didn't this guy get the attention?
Exactly.
And like, you know, but it's the old thing, the old saying, it's a squeaky wheel that gets the oil.
Yeah, right.
And I'd say, Rory, you got to be a
was not
squeaky
a
wheel.
squeaky wheel, I can tell you. All right, listen, folks, I'm sorry, we've taken up a lot of your time.
Oh, no,
Donal
it's
Gallagher, folks, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Come on, Donal.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
I want to take, Donal, before you go, I want to thank Dave Fanning for being here and all you. So you can sit down just for a little minute. Donal, and thank you, Dave, for that. It was absolutely brilliant.
Thanks, Barry.
And thank you for being here. On behalf of everyone here in Ballyshannon, obviously Rory's legacy has meant a lot to everybody who comes here every year. But from day one, 22 years ago, when I spoke to Donal, he's been a great friend to what we do here, a great supporter, Daniel, Owen, and all the family. I think we've honoured Rory very well over the years, from the festival to the statue. But tonight I'm going to ask Dave Fanning to join me to present Donal with our Rory Gallagher Festival Hall of Fame. It's the only one we'll ever do, and it's for you, Donal.
Oh, my God.
Hold on, I want to look at it first. Yeah, that's pretty good, all right. Donal, well done. Good man yourself.
Thanks very much.
Oh, jeez, he nearly fell out. You better take that. Hold it up to a camera.
I'm sharing this with you guys. It'll be on my mantelpiece, but I'll think about it, all Rory fans every time I look at it, and Ballyshannon. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks again, Dave.
Come on,
Thank
Donal.
you.
Thanks.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Barry.